Hello everyone, welcome and thank you for coming back to Listening In, the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society podcast. In this series, we want to give you the opportunity to listen in to some of the conversations that we are lucky enough to have every day. That is, with a variety of people and organisations all working in the field of mental health and well-being. Please be aware that suicide and bereavement by suicide is the main focus of this episode. Steve Roodhouse left for work one day and never came home. Caroline, his wife, was faced with the awful reality that Steve had taken his own life, and she found herself in the unimaginable position of having to tell their two young daughters, Evie, who was 9, and Ada, who was 2. Since then, Caroline has helped others understand about the reality of life after suicide by writing and speaking about her experience. And she gives a voice to others impacted by this particular type of grief. In her own sensitive, yet frank and unflinching way, Caroline describes how anger helped her cope and protected her from sadness. She talks about how finding the right therapist at the right time helped her through the complex emotions that a grief by suicide evokes. And she helps us understand the unique responsibility of being a double parent, living minute by minute, day by day, navigating her own grief while supporting Evie and Ada in theirs. But Caroline feels she is at last able to carry hope. Along with memories of Steve, hope has become part of the story that she and the girls are now writing together. Because this conversation is not just Caroline's story, but it's Steve's, Evie's, and Ada's also. And so, Caroline, just remind me how long you've been living with this, how long you've been living this part of your life story.
So it's always it shocks me how long it really is, actually. It was November 2018 that Steve died. So this year will be 7 years in November. It's actually Steve's birthday next week. So, the sort of 6th or 7th year of birthdays and anniversaries and all of those big milestone moments. Long time.
Yeah. How do you honour that? Does it depend year on year or on his birthday, or do the girls decide what to do?
It does really depend very much on things like the weather. So we'll go for a picnic sometimes if the weather's nice. We've always made his favourite cake, which is a Victoria sponge. And I have a picture each year of the girls sat in front of a Victoria sponge, and they get bigger every year and the cake looks smaller every year. But aside from that, we don't really have any traditions because they were 9 and 2 when he died, and they're now 15 and 8. They've changed massively. So the things they want to do are completely different to how we would have remembered Steve in the earlier days. So we just kind of go with the flow. We don't create any expectations on ourselves. If we decide to do nothing at all, nobody's going to say we feel guilty or we should be doing this or we should be doing that. We don't kind of use that sort of language around these really significant moments because it's so dependent on how we feel and what's going on at the time.
Yeah, of course. It's difficult as well sometimes in families, isn't it? Because each of us may be wanting to do something quite different as well. And I think with something like grief, it can be really difficult to negotiate that, can't it? Actually, especially with two children that are 2 different ages as well. You know, one wants to do something, one wants to do the other, and where you find that balance in honouring their wishes as well as your own.
It's very hard. And in the earlier days, I used to struggle with my own thoughts around whether I even tell them that there's these anniversaries coming up, because it's almost, do I tell them and create sadness, which is guaranteed, or do I not tell them and just kind of drift through the day as if nothing's happening, so that I'm not upsetting them? And then one year I chose the latter, and we got to the end of the day and Evie said, "Why haven't you said anything about Dad's birthday?" And I realised that wasn't the best choice. So every year I do gently kind of say something and make sure they know that I'm thinking of it, and they know that I'm preparing for it, but that there's no pressure around it. So I'm learning as I go along. So are they. And then we kind of learn together.
And how old would he have been this year?
Well, it's a good question. He was 47 when he died. So, yeah, 53 or 54. Yeah. I can't imagine him being that age. It's quite difficult. I always remember him as quite a young guy, because his passions and likes were all around adventure and travel and riding around on his mountain bike and those sorts of things. So he was never really a proper grown up in many respects. So to imagine him at 53 is hard.
Do you imagine he'd have still been just doing the same stuff?
I have some pictures of him that I'd like to share with the girls, maybe around his birthday, of when he was much younger, travelling in Australia, and he had long hair. He would carry around a surfboard on his shoulder that he couldn't really use properly, but he thought it looked cool. But yeah, that's how I prefer to picture him now, somewhere, wherever he is, with his long hair and his surfboard and his suntan, because I know that would be his happy place.
What a vibrant, happy, wonderful image to have and to remember. And I know that's not always easy, is it? Particularly in those very early stages, really, of any bereavement, but I think particularly a bereavement through suicide, when sometimes the way somebody died, how they died, the circumstances around it really takes over, doesn't it, from the memories of the person themselves. So I know I've said I want to leave this as open as I can for you without leading too much. So just to touch in on that, if that's okay, your memories around that time for yourself and your experience, Caroline.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, again, to look back at how much I've evolved in terms of my emotions towards the situation, but more importantly towards Steve. I spent the first weeks, months, even years just angry. I just remember feeling so angry all the time at the situation and at him. We'd been together for 18 years and we spoke about everything. We talked about ourselves, the kids, the house, work, everything, all the time. And the day that he went off to work and never came home again, he was normal. He left with a smile on his face. He confirmed what time he'd be home to pick Evie up from Cubs, like he always did on a Monday, and he left. And I remember feeling completely kind of cheated and lied to. Like, why did you leave like that when you knew that you weren't coming back? And I understand now that it's not that straightforward, but that's what was driving my anger and the sadness in my children, and the sadness that I felt he'd created in them, that will be with them forever. There was so much to carry. I remember feeling like permanently sick. It felt like this anger was a thing, like a physical thing inside me, that if I could just be sick, I could get rid of it, but I could never get rid of it. And I carried that for so long. I had PTSD therapy in the earlier days, which helped to deal with a lot of the things that would trigger that anger to go beyond anything manageable. So that helped a lot. And as the years went on, and my understanding of suicide and mental health and some of the circumstances around that time and his work conditions and things like that, a lot of what I was learning was helping me to reduce the anger I felt towards him. But I remember there being a very fine balance of anger and sadness, even after a few years. And I wanted the anger to stop the sadness coming in. And it almost blocked the sadness. I couldn't face the sadness. And then I had a conversation with a chap who I did a podcast with him, actually. He was from Australia, was a psychologist in a hospital in Australia. I connected with him on LinkedIn. And during this podcast, he asked me the most profound question that knocked me off my feet. This was only a couple of years ago. And he said, "What do you think Steve would say if he came back now and was able to speak to you?" And I remember having to park all the anger and picture this guy with long hair and a suntan and a smile that I loved and that loved me and our children, standing in front of me saying, "I'm sorry, and I didn't mean to cause any pain to anyone." And in that moment, that was the most significant moment that challenged my anger and almost made it evaporate in those few seconds. It was incredible, in a good way and in a bad way, because that then allowed the sadness to come flooding in. And I wasn't really ready for that. So I had to almost try and remain angry with him a little bit to manage the level of sadness that was coming at me, which was a very strange period of time that I went through. And a year on, I can now say that the balance of anger, sadness, and all the gazillions of other emotions is in a much better place. But it's been a wobbly journey.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing all that. It just to hear you talk about how the anger, not only at the time feeling so enormous and yet so necessary for your survival in some ways, as it held that sadness at bay, like this strong, I'm imagining like this strong dam, that's there, this big wall, and yes, and I mean, look at me as I'm describing it, I'm gripping my hands and all of that sort of thing, and then it almost yielding to the sadness, and yet you just holding on to those aspects of that anger, just almost to keep yourself afloat. I think we both know that many people listening to this will be counsellors, psychotherapists, practitioners in their own right. And I think it can be very easy for people to think that anger is something that needs to be, I mean, on some levels, of course, we know it needs to be managed if it's very extreme. But actually, it could be easy to think that that's something you have to go in and help somebody feel better, to sort of remove from somebody, if that makes sense, because, anger isn't good. We've got such a strange relationship with anger, haven't we, I think, in our culture in particular. And so I think to hear you describe it as so difficult, distressing, and yet at the same time so necessary may really help some people understand that aspect of it, particularly within a bereavement, a grief context.
Completely. I actually feel very fortunate when I think about the process I've been on with my emotions, because in the very early days, when I suddenly became a double parent to these two very young grieving children, I didn't have time, space, energy to process everything I needed to process. And the anger actually kept me afloat. It was not healthy, and it led me to some very toxic habits, which I had to then deal with separately. And I did through the help of different therapists and different support and coping mechanisms. And that anger kept me going for a good chunk of time, a good couple of years. And then as that started to reduce, and then eventually this chap came along with this question and pulled some of the logs out of that anger dam and let some of that flow through, that happened at the right time. It was a good sort of 4 years in, at least, that happened. And I think my anger had naturally come down to a manageable place, but it was still there doing its job. And then the sadness flowed in, and I knew I had to deal with that then. But I had the right coping mechanisms that I developed over that time to deal with the sadness that was coming in. My children were a bit older. They were well established with their own coping mechanisms. So I almost feel like there's been a good flow of different emotions at the right time. None of it's been easy. It's all been hellish, but it had to happen because Steve died. But it's happened at the right time, I feel, to allow it to kind of naturally flow through in the way that it's needed to.
And you've talked about receiving support for PTSD in those earlier stages. So that would have been your first experience of having some therapy around this?
I had therapy when I was younger, when I was a teenager, and I had the normal kind of ups and downs of teenage life. I don't remember much about that. I did start to see, I guess it was a counsellor in the very early days. I went to cruise and I was told that I would need to go on a waiting list, and they didn't take people on until they were sort of 6 months or more into their bereavement. So I paid separately to see a counsellor, which was literally just half an hour a week, speaking to a lady in a room with lots of kind of nods and smiles, which perhaps that was what I needed at the time, but it wasn't very constructive. It wasn't giving me tools and mechanisms that I felt like I needed. So I went from that to seeking out this guy who was ex-military, ex-police, no nonsense, structured action. And he then very quickly identified that I had PTSD and put me on this course of imaginal exposure, which was intense but helped. And that ran its course, and I didn't need to see him afterwards. I needed a break from that. And then I went on to see a psychologist during COVID, which again was a very different type of therapy, much more gentle, but almost a kind of combination of the two. So I'd had the counselling that wasn't really giving me a huge amount of tools and activities, but it was gentle. Then I had the kind of hardcore PTSD ex-military guy. And then I had this woman who was a kind of cross between the two. And I felt that I probably got the most value from her in the end. But again, that was timed right. I needed the other things when I had them, I think.
That's such an important point about the timing, the ability to choose who you want to see, the type of therapy that you feel will be helpful. And I know for the most part, people that aren't in the profession aren't necessarily aware of all the types of approaches and modalities of therapy that are out there. But I think still intuitively and instinctively, we can be sat with somebody and think to ourselves, oh my God, this is exactly what I need right now, or not, as the case may be. And then go, okay, so what else is there? Who else is there that can meet me where I am right now? And it sounds like you really knew what you needed at each moment in that process.
Yeah, I don't remember going into it thinking this is exactly what I need right now. Not entirely. I remember speaking to friends who gave me their thoughts and advice on what they felt I needed, trusted friends. So they helped to guide me. I didn't make those decisions kind of just on my own. But I think it was a combination of that kind of natural understanding that I needed something different.
Yeah.
And I did try out a few different ones in between that weren't right, and I didn't feel I was getting a huge amount of value from, and I had to make the decision to kind of stop those. I did get support for my children from various different sources within school and externally. And I've seen what's worked for them and what hasn't as well. So there's a lot to learn.
There is. Do you mind, I was just going to ask about that. So you've mentioned that phrase that I know when we've spoken before, we both fully advocate, and that's that phrase double parent, that when you lose a partner, that you are fulfilling both of those roles, and you are grieving and your children are grieving, and we'll come on to this in a bit, I'm sure, life doesn't stop either. They are still going to school. You still have a living that you need to make and to keep a roof over your heads. There's so much, life doesn't stop for us in that respect for anybody that's grieving. So there you are, you're double parenting. You are accessing at the right time that you feel you can, and in the right way you feel you can, therapeutic support for yourself. What about for Evie and Ada? What did that look like, and what did they respond to, or not, as the case may be, in terms of support?
Yeah, so initially, on the very first day that the police came and told us that Steve had been found, and he wasn't alive, we had somebody from the school network come and give us lots of leaflets and guidance and advice. She pointed us in the direction of Winston's Wish, who I contacted, and they sent some good guidance through some of their guidebooks. The Beyond the Rough Rock was the brilliant one. They sent little worry dolls for the girls and things. We were also put in touch with Simon Says, which was a local charity that did local support groups. Whilst Ada was very young, Evie was 9, and we would go along monthly to these support groups where there were other children who had been bereaved. But there was quite a combination of different types of bereavement, from a granddad to a friend to a hamster. And Evie was the only one there who'd lost a parent to suicide. And I think she felt quite isolated for that reason. So she wasn't, while she was understanding grief generally and doing lots of arts and crafts around waterfalls and things like that, I don't think it was helping with the kind of method and the way that Steve had died. And that was a much more complex thing to work through. She did get a bit of support through school, where she had Elsa. They then trained up a teacher to be able to deliver FIPES, which was the higher level kind of framework for, I can't remember what it stands for, but it was more about bereavement rather than just kind of emotional support. And then when Evie moved on to a different school, to senior school, she had challenges there. And she was, I think it was a therapy through the local authority, where we were able to get some support for 6 sessions with a local therapist who turned out to be brilliant. She was really, really good private therapist, and she would use metaphors a lot. And Evie loves reading, and that was a really good connection for her, which really helped. And it was more, kind of felt like more of an adult setting, more in tune with where she was at the time and what she needed, rather than support group. She responded well to the one-to-one therapy every week. And that helped massively for lots of reasons. And now Ada is going through the same process. She's now at the school that Evie was at, having the same teacher with the same FIPES, and now it's changed to Tala, which is a similar kind of weekly support for emotions and difficult feelings and bereavement support and those sorts of things. But I'm anticipating that she may well need support beyond that, as her journey of understanding is different. I recall the kind of 5 stages that Winston's Wish would talk about of supporting a child through a bereavement by suicide, and the first stage being very basic, that parent had died. The second stage being maybe starting to suggest that it was through suicide and that they'd done it to themselves, and then so on. So Evie's journey was all kind of neatly wrapped up in a few months with those 5 stages. Ada's been 5 years to take her through those 5 stages, and we're kind of still on stage 5, where we're talking about some of the reasons why Steve might have taken his own life. So that kind of, they're 2 very different journeys because of their different ages, has been something as a double parent, on top of everything else that I need to do as a double parent, has been quite a responsibility and a challenging journey for both of them. We've now got to a point where I talk about my triangle a lot. There's Evie, Ada and me in our very strong, solid triangle where we support one another. And Evie can have input as well, where she will teach Ada the things that she's learned, and I'm learning from Evie. So it's much less of a kind of top-down mother looking after these 2 kids. It's more of a kind of triangle where we're just in it together, which is a little bit easier.
That mutual reciprocal support, which I don't know, might sound odd to some people, but my goodness, I think any of us that know young children in particular know they have sometimes that ability to say something, to do something that just cuts through everything, doesn't it? Or just to, identify or name something that sometimes we may be afraid to or may not have even noticed. And out they come with it, and it just stops you in your tracks, doesn't it? And it's like, they get it. They get it, and they've helped me understand that.
Yeah, 100%. I learn as much from them as they do from me. I recall a moment a couple of years ago where we were on the school run, and Ada said to me, men don't grieve, men don't cry. They should, because if they cried and let the emotions out, they would live longer. And I remember thinking, I have no idea where that came from or why it's come out now on the school run, but it did help me understand how she was processing what she was learning from me, from the teachers at school, from all of this interaction, and understanding where Daddy might have been, and what maybe he might have needed, and for the future for her to understand and help other people. That was one of those moments where you just think, wow.
We really need to understand how much they witness and how much they absorb, don't we? Instead of, which I think we do now so much better than perhaps 20, 30, 40 years ago when, children weren't part of that grieving process. Often they weren't acknowledged in that. It seems unbelievable to us now to imagine, doesn't it? But
I come across people in their 40s and 50s who are just discovering that when their parent died when they were children, that it wasn't cancer or a car crash, it was suicide, but it was brushed under the carpet because the family didn't know how to even begin to approach that subject, so they chose not to. But the truth comes out eventually, and the trust within that family is then shattered, and that was one of my biggest fears, that I didn't ever want to happen. And why I was honest with them from day one. And I'm glad now that I was, even though they were awful conversations to have. I know that they know everything they need to know. There's nothing hiding.
Yeah, trust is there, and they don't. You can't imagine what that's like for somebody that then has to start revisiting their grief all over again through a completely different lens. It's unimaginable. And all this time, Caroline, as I alluded to earlier, of course, as I described, life does go on, and you are having to consider work in all of this, as well as your well-being, the children's well-being, friendships, family, everything else around it. Before we started recording today, we said, didn't we, that just everything changes. How would you help people understand that aspect of grief, but again, particularly grief through suicide?
Yeah, I think coming back to this term double parenting is a really important factor, because I'm often surprised at the assumptions that people make. And when they talk about being a single parent, for example, they may have the kids every other weekend and then the kids go to the other parent. They may have a good relationship with an ex-partner who is co-parenting with them. That's very different to double parenting, where you really are the only parent. You're one person, and you're the one person reliant on for getting up in the night when they're sick, doing the washing, earning a living, getting them to school, getting them back from school, feeding them, teaching them. Everything is on you. And when they come home crying because they've had issues at school or friends are being horrible, everything is on you. And I think for people to acknowledge that, whether you're friends with somebody bereaved, whether you're a family member, an employer, or a colleague, to empathise with that situation as much as you possibly can, and recognise that there are different pressures on a double parent to anybody else. It's quite a unique responsibility. And I would urge people to make sure that they understand what those pressures are, and that they accommodate for those pressures as much as they possibly can anyway, and do that through communication. Have conversations, talk about what you've done at the weekend, what's coming up that's going to be challenging for you, and how to accommodate that. I know that, for example, flexible working is such a massive thing now, and it's helping people like me hugely to know that they're respected enough to work in that way. So it's more of these conversations being treated with respect and trust, but knowing that there are some things that a double parent simply can't achieve without the support of other people. And also, I think, again, we spoke earlier about the fact that this goes on forever. Every single day, something comes up that relates to Steve. And the fact that he's not here. And that could be something really small that's just a kind of sad moment, and I kind of wish he was here to have that conversation with, to something massive that really highlights, we can't do this as a family of three. We would need somebody else. We would need Steve to be here to achieve that. And that could be going on a holiday, for example. I won't go abroad with the girls. I don't feel confident enough to do that. And that impacts us and them. There's things they want to do. There's things I can't afford to do because I'm a single earner. They want to go on school trips and I'm having to say no, because it's literally just me earning the money. So it's constant, daily, that things come up that still relate to the fact that Steve isn't here. And also that he died in the way that he did. When we hear about suicide, when you turn on the TV and there's, on Netflix, there's always a warning at the top, there's violence, or there's smoking or swearing or whatever it might be. It's unimaginable how many of these programs have suicide related to them. There's always seems to be something to do with suicide, and it always triggers me or the children. It's just constant. Every day there's something that brings us back to this. So I would say to other people just to remain as conscious as you possibly can, and as sensitive as you possibly can to the needs of other people. And please don't say things like, my husband's away for a couple of days, so I'm having to look after my kids on my own, because I don't take that well. That's my summary of the situation.
And I know you and I have sort of discussed before, haven't we? It's just being mindful, isn't it? It's, I suppose, in sort of in showbiz and entertainment, they talk about knowing your audience. And I think there's something in that, isn't there? That when you're just having a conversation with somebody and there's a story such as this, that they are still living, it's just be mindful of that. Just be mindful of that. It isn't like divorce or separation. And of course, that has complications itself too. It doesn't have to be compare and contrasting, or which is worse than the other, but it's just being mindful of those unique situations that apply to each.
Yeah, and I know nobody's perfect. I know we
Of
slip up,
course.
and I know we'll say things that can be just an innocent comment. But like you say, if we're all just a little bit more mindful, I think there's a lot of situations we could avoid.
Yeah, there's no break from double parenting, really, is there? Particularly, I think, when the children are younger. There's nobody there just to say, sit down, I'll pop the kettle on for you. Or and sometimes I know, having spoke with other people in a similar situation, that there can be people that are fearful. They're scared. They want to help, but they're scared of saying or doing the wrong thing, particularly perhaps around children. And so sometimes people can take a step back, can't they? And then all of a sudden you look around and there aren't the same people in your life that there might have been before, or not in the same, perhaps quite in the same way. Just so many things change, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Everything, the family dynamics, friendships, going out as families with other people, who still are a mum and a dad and the kids. It's feeling like you don't quite belong anywhere anymore.
Yeah.
And the temptation then is to kind of withdraw from society completely. And I've been through periods of time where I've done that because it's just been easier to avoid seeing dads at school, on the school run, bringing their kids in and stuff like that, and kids going to parties where Ada's come home and said, how come their dad's brain works but my dad's brain didn't work properly, and things like that. So sometimes you think, oh, it's easier just not to get involved, but you can't avoid it entirely.
Yeah, but sometimes that's a legitimate choice too, isn't it? Sometimes it's just like, not ever, but not today or not now. I'm just going to be a conscientious objector to some of these things and just step away and choose not to. Yeah.
Hunker down with blankets and chocolate and just the three of us. And yeah, there are moments when that's still necessary and that's okay.
And Carolyn, we can't have this conversation, and I'm conscious of the time in it, without mentioning Daddy Blackbird. So you're discussing, you're helping us understand the enormity of this and the toll it can take, and the amount you're having to balance and give your energy to. And yet throughout this, at some point, you put, I was going to say pen to paper or finger to keyboard, whichever it was, and you write your story and you write a book. Tell us a little bit about that, if that's okay.
So I went through a long period of time where I didn't sleep at all. I'm not a good sleeper anyway, but it was also while I was having therapy, and I was often reminded that writing can be really therapeutic and cathartic. So I would, in these hours of being awake, I would often write how I was feeling and just kind of record experiences and chunks of time and particular moments like the funeral or the inquest. And I almost didn't want to forget the detail. I wanted to have a record of it somewhere. I wanted to get it out of my head and onto paper. So there were lots of reasons why I felt the need to write, and I like writing too. And then at some point I looked down at my notes app and I realised I'd probably written about 20,000 words, and people would often say, oh, why don't you just write a book? You've kind of almost done it anyway. And I thought, well, why not? I will. And I had only one name I could call it. In the early days after Steve had died, there was a blackbird that would come up to the back door and hop around and was very persistent, and I wanted to create some connection for the girls and between Steve and them, and I would just say, look, Daddy Blackbird's come to visit. I just sort of came out from nowhere, and the name stuck, and I called my book Daddy Blackbird, and I published it last year, and I'm very pleased that I've got this whole record of the experience, not only for me but for other people to learn from. When people say, how did you get through the last few years, I can say, read that and, and you'll understand, because there's not one simple answer. There's a lot. And I structured it in terms of the history of who we were as a family to make sure people knew who Steve was and that he was a real person and that he lived and he created 2 children and lots of amazing friendships and experiences and adventures that can never be sort of removed. Then there was the horror section, which was the obvious kind of middle bit when he died and everything that came after that. But arguably the most important section is the hope section at the end, which is all about my triangle of recovery, the fact that I leaned on myself, my community, and my children to help heal. And I wanted people to know that they could learn from that section more than anything, that there is hope, there is a future. It's very different, and it might not be a square shape, it might be a triangle shape, and that's okay. And lots of lessons that I'd learned that I wanted to pass on using that particular section of the book. That was kind of the most important thing for me.
I'm so conscious that in our conversation today, we've barely scratched the surface of what an experience like this can be. And so, I wholeheartedly encourage people, if they want to know more about whether that's generally bereavement by suicide for a remaining parent, whether that's your unique story and perspective on that, because again, everybody's will be different regardless, then they need to read it, and hopefully that will help them understand more. And you mentioned hope at the end, and I suppose that's sort of where I wanted to bring our conversation to a close and say, you've helped us understand what happened, what that path has been like that you've walked since Steve died, and just to ask you where you are now, where the girls are now, and the hope within that. And I use that word because I know it's a word that you wholeheartedly, hold close to you and believe in. So yeah, where would you say things are now, and what hope can be extrapolated from that?
Yeah, I think that the whole idea of a grieving process I struggle with, because a process suggests to me that there's a flow, there's a destination. I think that hope is something that I've just kept in my mind. That is a part of grief, and that will help you through the really challenging moments. And I've found that I've held on to that. I struggled with any sense of hope in the early days, and it was a therapist that introduced the concept to me when she said, I can see that you're shattered, you've got nothing to give, and you can't see a way forward, and I will carry your hope for you until you're ready to carry it for yourself. And that to me was probably the most transformative moment, when I thought hope is what I need to hold on to. And if I can't carry it, other people can, until I'm ready to carry it. And I feel now that I'm strong enough and capable enough to carry hope by the bucket load. Thanks to all the support and help and learning, and seeing my children growing and thriving and doing all the amazing things that they're doing, and being part of a community of people who are in a similar position to me, that have lifted me and carried my children. So many different elements that have contributed to this feeling of hope that I feel now, that is crucial to moving forward and healing and being a whole person in my own right, and being a confident double parent, not a frightened double parent. So yeah, I'm just grateful that I've learned all the things I've learned, and met all the people that I've met that have helped me to feel hope when I went through a long period where I never could imagine ever feeling that.
There's so much I could reflect back in what you've just said, but I don't think I should, and I don't think I ought to, because everything you've said there and the words you've used and the way you've described it is just perfection in itself. So I think it's your words that are important there rather than anything I have to respond to in that. You are such an incredible advocate, Caroline, as you say, for anybody that's been in this position, for anybody that's been bereaved, in particular, people bereaved by suicide, but parents in that, people that are supporting their children in that and are having to juggle and find a place for each and every individual's member of the family's place within that grief is, I mean, it's just almost, it feels impossible, but here you are, you've lived it and breathed it and are doing it. And I know how incredibly difficult that is, but here you are using this platform and your experience now to help others. And it's quite remarkable what you do.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. I've learned from so many others, and I feel like I'm passing on that learning to other people. It feels like a responsibility that I couldn't not embrace. So I feel privileged to be able to pass it on.
Thank you to Caroline for sharing her personal story. And thank you for listening in. To find Caroline's book, Daddy Blackbird, and information about the child bereavement charity Winston's Wish, links will be in the show notes below. This podcast is brought to you by the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, a professional home for counsellors, psychotherapists, and over 120 wellbeing organisations across the UK. Autonomy, diversity, creativity, and community are at the heart of what we do. We're creating a positive space for conversations with people who share common beliefs and goals, because together, our voice is louder. If you would like to know more about the NCPS, please visit www.ncps.com for more information. And please remember to follow and subscribe to this podcast so you're always part of the conversation.